Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Dr. Navid. Okay, he's on the screen. Dr. Navid, the young man that sits next to Morris is Dr. Navid. Yeah, so he's okay.
Boker Tov, Boker Tov.
Boker Tov, Boker Tov. Right, if it's for a mitzvah, right. Oh, one second. So the Gemara says that father hitting the son will classify in the category of mitzvah. That's something that needs to be done. But sukkah, the Gemara said, if he's cutting the wood for the sukkah, since that could be accomplished sometimes without actually cutting the wood for the sukkah, can be accomplished if let's say, if a Gentile cut the wood, you found the wood cut, the branches came down, there was a nice storm, and the wood is cut. You don't need anybody to necessarily. Cutting the wood is not always a necessary thing to be done, the Gemara said. Therefore, the Gemara says we're not going to classify the cutting of the wood as a level of the mitzvah that you would be exempt, that a person would be exempt from. Correct, Mr. Safdie? Okay, the fact that a situation happened that there's no wood around, but since it's not something that you have to have done, it's only the preparation of the mitzvah, right? It's something you need to do to get the mitzvah going, but it's not something that has to be done, that can be done without the cutting of the wood. Therefore, the Gemara said that will not exempt the person from going to exile. If a person, as a result of cutting wood for the sukkah, someone died. That's what the Gemara is holding until here. Now, we're still on 8A. We're getting towards the bottom. We're about 6 lines from the bottom. So in the art scroll, most probably it's 8A, I'm guessing 4 or something. Let's see. 884. 884 on the bottom, Hada Amar Rava, on the first column in the English, on the bottom, Hada Amar Rava. Now Rava comes to a different conclusion than what he said, what he said before. By the way, you should know that based on Rava's next answer, there are those that will say that if a person is chopping wood for a sukkah, which Mr. Safdie is really a big advocate of that, if it's chopping wood for a sukkah or for the mizbeach, that would also be included in mitzvah. And if when he's engaged in that, someone gets killed, he does not go to exile. Why? Because they're going to classify that the cutting of the wood as a mitzvah. They're gonna it's enough of a no. If you need the wood the fact that it has to be a mitzvah. The question is what's called mitzvah, and so the question is, would you classify the cutting of the wood as a mitzvah? Right. He doesn't. Right. He's not deserving of the punishment of exile. Right. Good morning, Mr. Ajmi. But others will still say that we don't consider the cutting of the wood.
Good morning.
Mitzvah. Good morning, because it's only preparation of the mitzvah. Right? Good morning, Mr. Azmi. It was good to see you yesterday.
Yeah, I saw you from afar. I thought you were coming over, but I never got to shake your hand.
Yeah, I know. Forgive me also. I saw you also from afar. I got a little dance with the Khatan and Albert, but I didn't get to dance with you. Forgive me.
I know. It was not your siniyut requirements, huh?
Mr. Andrew, we'll talk later. All right. Good to see you.
All right. Go ahead.
Okay. The Gemara says the following. I was proceeding with caution, Mr. Ajmi. Okay.
Absolutely, we understand.
Okay. Good morning. Now, so the Gemara says the following. Ama Rava. Rava says the following. You have it? Amar Rava, lav miltahi de amri. Rava says it's that when I the answer that I gave before, I have a better answer than I gave before. The question was, what was the question of the Gemara? How do we know what's the source for Abba Shaul that if a person, if he's engaged in a mitzvah, he does not, and an accident happened, he does not go to exile. And the case of the Torah was he was involved in non-mitzvah activity. And like I was mentioning to Mr. Haber before the class, the Torah always likes to tell us the bigger chidush. If the Torah tells us the smaller chidush, that means that's only that. Ein bo ela chidusho. You only know that, you don't know something bigger than that. So what's the bigger chidush? Going to exile as a result of a voluntary act, or going to exile as a result of an act that you were mandated by God to do, but an accident happened on the job, you have to go to exile. The bigger chiddush would be that even when you're involved in a mitzvah, where you were forced, so to speak, of course, the force is out of love, you were told to go ahead and do the mitzvah, and yet if an accident happens as a result of that mitzvah activity, you still have to go to exile. That would be a chidush. If you would tell me that I'm involved in a mitzvah activity, I go to exile. Certainly if I'm not involved in a mitzvah activity, I go to exile. But the fact that the Torah tells us the case of chopping wood, which is a case of non-mitzvah activity, that teaches us that only that you go to exile, but you will not know if you're involved in a mitzvah activity. When God signed you up to that activity. Morning, Nathan. Now, how do we know that the case of the Torah is talking about a non-mitzvah activity? Becomes Rava. So yesterday we learned because chopping of the wood is not something that you have to do for a mitzvah. It can be done without. Mitzvah could be accomplished many times without chopping the wood. So the fact that the case of the Torah, the fact that God picks this case when He wants to tell us the case, the poster boy case of going to exile. What do you say? He goes to chopping wood. That's the case the Torah picks. It's the Torah. The Torah is picking that case. It's not random. It's picking that case to say that is the case. But if it's not mitzvah, but if it's a mitzvah case, you will not go to exile. Comes Abba Shaul, it comes out Rava and says, I have a different point to show you that the case of the Torah is non-mitzvah case. How do we know it's a non-mitzvah case? Because the pasuk used a word, asher, that you came there. The fact that you're saying someone that you came there, that means something that you did not have to do. You know, that you went there. You went to the store. You went to the forest. That is the word. The word asher means voluntary. Good morning, Jaime. Good morning, Yosef. I hope you weren't waiting long on the screen. I just noticed. Good morning.
Morning.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome back. We are on the Chet Amud Aleph 8a. Say that again. Mark Ashby's right. It's on the screen. Yeah, Mark. Hi, Mr. Haber's asking for you, Mark. He misses you. Okay. So the Gemara says the following. Mark is right here. How do you like that? Mark is here. You are Chet Amud Aleph 8a. 884 towards the bottom, left column. 884, left column, the first column on the bottom. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Alav Milti Damri. I have a better answer. And we welcome Nathan back. Vasher Yavo et Re'eu B'yam. You have it, Mr. Ezra? The pasuk says, you came with your friend. We should know the hospital did two printings on Makkos. By the way, there's two printings on Makkos. One's an older version and one's a newer version. So they're not always in the same exact spot. Vasher Yavo et Re'eu B'yam. You came with your friend to the forest. The boy ayo. If you wanted to come, you came. You came there. That you came. That you came. That you went there. Meaning something that you decided that you did. That means if you wanted to come there, you came there. If you didn't want to come, you didn't go. Because if it would be, you got it? Because if you would be mandated to come there, it's not that you came there. You had to go there. The word asher indicates a voluntary, the term asher, something that you did, indicates something that you didn't have to do, but you on your own went and decided to, that you went there. Not that you were mandated to go ahead, because the pasuk could have said, when you went. If it's something you're mandated to do, the pasuk would have said, when you go to such and such a place, and that happens. Not that you go to such a place, when you go. The fact that the Torah uses this word asher tells you we're talking about an activity was your decision. You weren't told to do it. When you put on tefillin in the morning, you're told to put on tefillin in the morning. When you go to the store to buy yourself a coffee, that's your decision to buy a coffee. So that's what the Gemara says. The fact that it says asher, now the Isa Kadaitach, if you think mitzvah, if you think the case of the Torah was a mitzvah, you were involved in a mitzvah activity, you had to do it. So misagya, the lo ayal, it's not good enough. It's not enough not to go. It's not something you have a right to decide whether I need to go, I want to go, I don't have to want to go. It's not something that I signed myself up. I've already been signed up to do. So that's the Gemara's Morning Akiva. That's the Gemara saying how we know that the case of the Torah, when the Torah tells us a person has to run to exile as a result of a certain level accident, that he killed someone, we know it's talking specifically about a voluntary activity that he was involved in, not a mitzvah activity. Because if it would have been a mitzvah activity, the word asher would not have been used.
Thing that you do for mitzvah is considered your own will.
Oh, so the Gemara says, the Gemara before said the preparation for a mitzvah, if it's not the actual mitzvah, would also not reach the level of mitzvah. That's considered also valid in a certain meaning. If that type of preparation, at least from the Gemara, if that type of preparation might not always have to be done by, sometimes if that preparation could be missed, there's a part that doesn't have to always be done. Let's say the Gemara says cutting wood, chopping wood, right, something like that. That might not reach that one. We won't categorize that as the mitzvah at that level. So the Gemara says. So the Gemara now is going to challenge this approach. Ela me'ata. I have a following question. The ish asher yitma. We have a pasuk in the Torah that says if a person is tamei, v'lo yischata. Morning, Daniel. I was thinking about it yesterday. Isha was tamei v'lo yischata, and he does not purify himself. And he enters into the Beit HaMikdash, or he enters into the Ohel Moed, he enters the holy place, he gets kareh. And that's why, by the way, you should know by the Temple Mount area, by the areas with the Har HaBayit and the dome, that those areas, many of the most poskim, most say that if a person would go to some of those spots today, there would be chayav kareh. That the holiness of those spaces, therefore, there are certain individual rabbis that allow certain places, but the majority of the rabbis say you got to stay away from certain, by the temple, by the Temple Mount, the temple, whatever, where the Dome of the Rock is, all those areas, because that's the area where the Beit HaMikdash, certain, that's the closer areas of holiness. The tunnels okay. The tunnels okay that are, but the other places that are, there's certain places that there are even tours that, there are tours that people go, but they should stay away. Rabbi Yosef and many of the poskim say stay away from all those, those places. Because the holiness remains. That even though the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed, the holiness still remains. So Rabbi, here we have.
There's a place where you go on a tour in the Kotel where they said this is the closest spot to Kodesh Kodashim. Are you allowed to go there?
As long as it's the rabbis, the majority of the rabbis say right. If the tunnels are fine. Those tunnels by the Western Wall tunnels that you go by next to the Kotel, coming from that area, those Western Wall tunnels are fine. but not by the dome. Everyone stay away from the dome of the rock. Stay away from that area. Have to be very careful. Now, the Gemara now says here. Now, by the way, it's also a very interesting pasuk. The pasuk says the following: Isha sheyitma, if a person becomes contaminated, v'lo yischata, and he does not purify himself, the pasuk says he gets kareh. Rashi in the Chumash says, what's the case if a person became tamei, he was contaminated and did not purify himself, he gets kareh. He had to do what did he do wrong? He went into the Beit HaMikdash. He went into that holy spot. But it's very interesting the way the Torah writes the case. The Torah just says, if a person becomes tamei and he did not purify himself, he gets kareh. Now, let me ask you a question. If a person becomes tamei and he doesn't purify himself, he won't get kareh unless he made a move. He had to make a move. He had to go into the what? To the temple, to the Beit HaMikdash. So why does the Torah write it in such a fashion? The Torah writes it like this. The person became tamei, contaminated. He didn't purify himself. He gets kareh. And Rashi has to fill in the blank. There's something warning Aaron. What's the blank that Rashi has to fill in? And he went into the Beit HaMikdash. So why didn't the Torah write it openly? The person became tamei, and he enters the Mikdash, then he gets kareh, then he gets cut off from the next world. Why, Mark, you hear the question? Why does the Torah leave out a key the main part?
So he doesn't get cut in.
If he doesn't go in. So what's the, Mr. Haber, you hear the question? The Torah, Nathan, you hear the question. The Torah says a person's contaminated and he doesn't purify himself, he gets kareh. He gets cut off. If a guy doesn't walk into the Beit HaMikdash and he's contaminated, he doesn't get kareh. Only if he walked in. And Rashi says it. He gets kareh if he walked in. So why did the Torah say and he walked in? So I wanted to say the following answer to this question. The Torah says if a person is contaminated and he does not purify himself, he gets kareh, gets cut off in the next row. And Rashi says that's only, and he went into the Beit HaMikdash, If he didn't go into the Beit HaMikdash, he's not going to get kareh because he didn't get purified from being contaminated. So only if he went into the Beit HaMikdash under being contaminated. So why does the Torah write it in such a fashion without telling us this point that he also did not, and he also went into the Beit HaMikdash? The only time he'll get kareh if he went into the Beit HaMikdash. So why did the Torah write that openly? He was tamei, he was contaminated, he didn't purify himself, and he went into the Beit HaMikdash. So I wanted to say perhaps the Torah is teaching us the following. You need to know that if you're tamei and you don't purify yourself, you're already connected to this kareh. What does that mean? You've already created put yourself in a vulnerable spot. Because you know you might go to the Beit HaMikdash. You're a holy Jew. You go to holy places. Don't leave yourself in that situation. Of course, the only time the person will get kareh is only if he actually enters the Beit HaMikdash. But the Torah writes in such a way that if it hits you in your eyes and say, the Torah is telling me without even going into the Beit HaMikdash, the Torah is talking about kareh, but the Torah is teaching you can't just being tamei and leaving yourself and not purifying yourself. You're playing with fire because you know there's a good chance you might go to the Beit HaMikdash. And therefore, just that in itself, the Torah perhaps is telling you remaining not purified in itself, you're connecting with kareh because you're already opening up the door for kareh to come because you might go into the Beit HaMikdash. Oh, was it? So the Gemara says, because the pasuk says over there, the ish asher yitma. The case is the Torah says if it uses the word asher. So the same way the Torah used the word asher when it comes to going to the wood, it uses, and the Gemara says the word asher means voluntary. Here, it also says the word asher when it comes to ish asher yitma. And yet, now what does the Torah say? Now, the case of the Torah, when a person becomes contaminated and he goes into the Beit HaMikdash, he will get kareh. Is it only if he became contaminated under voluntary circumstances, or is even if he became tamei under mandated circumstances? He was involved in a mitzvah. He found there was a dead body on the street, on the road, and the Torah obligates the person to go ahead and make himself make himself tameh. He has to contaminate himself. So the guy who was involved with a mate mitzvah, or the guy like the Chevra Kadisha, he was involved in that mitzvah where he was mandated, and then subsequently he goes into the Beit HaMikdash. Are you going to tell me he does not get kareh? He will get kareh. So the pasuk that says the Rud Asher is not only referring to a voluntary thing that he did, even a mandated thing. Because the case of the Torah by contamination is even when you are mandated to contaminate yourself, that's when the pasuk also implies that he gets kareh.
So, God,
Cuts the wood.
don't forget cut the wood. That's secondary. A primary thing that you do, primary mitzvah that you do that results in the death, you have to
Should also have to go to God. That's what the Gemara is saying, because the fact that the Torah used the word asher does not indicate you're dealing with a voluntary act. We proved from another case in the Torah, from the case of Tumah, that the word asher means even a mitzvah activity. So too, when you were involved in part of the war in the forest, maybe the Torah is not referring to only an activity that was a voluntary activity. The Torah is referring to even an activity that's a mandated activity.
way beyond cutting wood.
Right.
Building a sukkah,
Whatever mitzvah that,
fall down on somebody or later they die, you have to go.
according to this question of the Gemara. So that's what the Gemara says. And now we're reading it inside. Are you going to tell me? Are you going to tell me that the case of the Torah is only a case where he voluntarily made himself tameh? The case is, but if he did not want to make himself tameh, that Torah is not talking about that case. Mate mitzvah. A mate mitzvah, when a person was found on the road, we have a mitzvah you're mandated. Even if you're a Kohen, the Kohen has to go ahead and make himself tameh. Even the Kohen Gadol has to make himself tameh. The Kohen Gadol who does not defile himself, even the 7 close relatives, he has to go ahead and make himself tameh for a mate mitzvah. Mate mitzvah de lo sagi de lo metameh. Hachinami de potur. Are you going to tell me that if the guy was involved in a mitzvah activity that contaminated him, are you going to tell me if he subsequently goes into the Beit HaMikdash while being contaminated, he's going to be patur from kareh? We never found such a thing because the circumstances that you became tameh, just like we had in the Torah when the story with the Korban Pesach. People said, we are tameh. We want to bring the Korban Pesach, but we can't bring the Korban Pesach. What do? And how they became tameh? Because they were involved in burying people. Because they were involved in burying people, they became tameh. So therefore, the fact that we don't say, okay, you became tameh, now you can go ahead and bring a Korban Pesach in Tumah. You were mandated to become tameh. Now everything goes. Now you can go bring the Korban. No, they had a Pesach Sheni. They had to wait till the next month. So that's the Gemara's question. The Gemara is questioning, how do we say that asher, the word asher means only voluntary, non-mitzvah? We find it's used even if you were involved in a mitzvah. So the Gemara says, no. The word asher, the Gemara says, means involuntary, that you decided to do. Something that you on your own made a decision to go ahead and do. And therefore, the Gemara says, by the case of the forest, they used the word asher yavo etrei. So that you voluntarily did. But if you would have been a mitzvah with a Torah mandates you will not have to go to exile. But why by the case of Tumah? Why by the case of Tumah that we say that it even applies even in a mitzvah case, and even though it used the word asher, because there's another pasuk that teaches us, that adds the case of mitzvah. Meaning to say, the Gemara is saying what we said before was correct. The word asher means voluntary. But why by the case of Tumah does it include more than voluntary contamination? Why does it Why does it include even mandated contamination? Because the Torah wrote some extra words over there by Torah. Those extra words are going to include the case of mandated contamination. And those extra words are going to tell us, even when you were mandated, you were told, you were instructed by God to contaminate yourself for a mitzvah, still, you're still not allowed to go to the Beit HaMikdash under such a level of contamination. That's what the Gemara is going to say. Still chayiv karet if he goes. Correct. That's what the Gemara. Shiny hatam. The last word of the page. By the way, everybody got what's going on? I know it's a lot going on. Anyone has anything they need to speak up, feel comfortable to speak up. Shiny hatam. There it is different, the Gemara says. The Amakra, the Pasuk says, now we're turning the page, Mabruk. The Amakra, we're now at Chet Amid Beis. The case of the Tumah. The case of contamination, the Torah tells us there an extra words over there to teach us not only a voluntary case of Tumah, even a mandated case of Tumah. Shani Hatam, Tameh Yihiyeh. The Pasuk used the word Tameh he shall be. That means the word Tameh Yihiyeh is coming to include all different circumstances. And because if you look at the Pasuk says the following. I'm going to read the Pasuk. Anybody who touches a mate, comes in contact with a mate, and he doesn't purify himself, he defiles the Mishkan by entering the Mishkan, he gets karet because he did not sprinkle the waters of purification upon, he didn't have the paradum on him. Tameh yeh, he shall be tameh. What do you tell me, tameh? He shall be tameh. You told me he's tameh. You already told me in the pasuk that somebody who was tameh, who was contaminated, they didn't sprinkle the water of paraduma on him. So why do you need to tell me the verse? He shall be tameh. You already told me that he's tameh. What did you say? Yeah, me. He came with a dead body. He came in contact with that. He became contaminated. And the fact that you're telling me that tameh he is tameh, that means we're coming to include he's tameh, not only the voluntary guy, even the guy. Good morning, Mr. Feldman, one Ariel. Even the guy who was mandated tameh, the guy who was told by the Torah to contaminate himself, he's tameh, he shall be tameh, and therefore even the guy who was mandated is tameh, and therefore if he goes into the Beit HaMikdash under the tumah, under the contamination, he is chayiv karet. The extra words is tameh, he shall be tameh. Who is that including? That's including that guy who was mandated to contaminate himself.
That's to say that someone without
chopping wood is still a voluntary act. The case of the Torah about chopping the wood, it says asher. The word asher means voluntary. Therefore, the only time to go to exile by chopping wood, only under voluntary circumstance. If you're involved in a mitzvah, you're off the hook. The Torah, you will not have to go to exile. But when it comes to contamination, tumah, he's subject to karet. Karet means to be, Rambam says, to be cut off from the next world. He's subject to karet, even though it was not a voluntary contamination, even though it was a contamination because the Torah obligated him to contaminate himself, to bury a person that was in the road, even though it was a mandated contamination. The Torah over there, even though it used the word asher, but it used extra, brought in extra words of tameh to add not only a voluntary case, even a mandated case, if you were contaminated, even though you were told to be contaminated, and then you went into the Beit HaMikdash.
Someone did a voluntary act by not purifying himself.
That's a good point. He could have
himself open.
Very good. Mr. Ashby is saying a good reason why this should be different if the guy was contaminated, because the Torah mandated him to become contaminated. Why should we be as strict with him as someone who voluntarily contaminated himself? Is because even the guy who was mandated by the Torah to contaminate himself, he still had the ability to go ahead and, I don't know if there's a word, decontaminate himself, purify himself. He could have got the ash of Torah Duma, sprinkled on him, like the Torah says, when having person becomes Tamei, and he didn't do it.
That's all.
So therefore, that act is a voluntary, and therefore maybe that's why the Torah is even strong with such a person. Very nice idea. The Kohanim are not allowed to go ahead and become in contact with dead bodies.
No, they have to.
Only the seven close relatives, right, 7 close relatives. So they would have to, again, there's different types of tumah. A Kohen, there's certain tumas you're allowed to go ahead and make yourself tameh, meaning the Kohen can handle a dead animal. That's not, I mean, animal that was slaughtered, again, animal that was slaughtered is not tameh. If it was slaughtered properly, but an animal dies, it's called an avela. A person has relation with their wife, they become tameh. Therefore, but that tumah is a lower level tumah. Just go to the mikveh. Then there's certain different levels, right? But there's different tumah coming with account with a dead body. That mikveh is not enough. You got to go. They have to have the ashes of the parah adumah on them. There's a process. 3rd day, the 7th day. You know that's what the Gemara here seems to. The case of the Torah, we have to see more about it. But the case of the Torah, by entering the mikdash, and he did not purify himself, he was contaminated. The case of the Torah is the contamination was a contamination, a high level contamination. He had come in contact with a dead body. That's a very high level contamination. There are all different types of contamination. Most contaminations only require going to the mikvah. But this contamination, the Torah says that he'll get karet. Again, we have to see more than the halacha. But the case of the Torah, black and white here, is that he was contaminated to a dead body. And that's the case that he enters the Beit HaMikdash, he will get the morning, he will get karet. Okay? So the Gemara says,
Rabbi, is it the reason why the Torah is giving this example? Is it because it's a capital punishment? And if you kill someone, whether it's voluntary and involuntary, is also capital punishment per se?
yeah, but the Gemara is saying even.
But it's
even
coming
if
to.
Yeah, but we're
but
saying
it's coming to
that if but the Gemara is saying that even though you're mandated to do the mitzvah, the Torah says when you were mandated to do the mitzvah and you killed someone, you will not go to exile. So even though it's a case of someone died, still the Torah is going to be lenient. You still do not need to go to exile. Say it again. It depends how if you touched him. If you didn't touch him, if a guy shoots a bullet at someone, throws an axe, he doesn't become tamei by killing him, unless you come in contact. You must touch it.
Building a sukkah falls down on the guy. You're not done.
Unless you're under the roof. If you're under the same if you're in the same room with the person, that makes if there's a dead body in the room, and anybody in the room will become contaminated.
Rabbi, I thought from the proof of the Gemara, we learned that if you become tameh and there was a commandment to go and do the mitzvah and you still became tameh, you still can't go to the services, Beit HaMikdash. So exactly. So it just comes to show you that even when you're doing a mitzvah, okay, this is the only exception that you're not off the hook, correct?
Right, you're not.
Meaning you're not off the hook of karet. How is that coming to justify that if you're doing an involuntary, voluntary act, and the person dies, you're off the hook?
Yeah,
it's trying to say. What we're trying to say is like if it's a mitzvah to do this act, to go and chop the wood in the field, and someone dies, you're not going to go to exile. Meaning you're off the hook.
Right. Because Dr. David, because the Gemara is focusing on the word of the psukim. They're totally two different subjects. They're totally two different subjects. The Gemara is just focusing what does the word asher mean, and the Gemara established that's what we're focusing on. Asher means voluntary, unless there's some other words of psukim to tell us the case of Asher would mean specifically voluntary act. By the case of Tumah, bless you, the Torah told us an extra pasuk to include non-voluntary acts, even mandated acts. Then the Gemara says, hey, the Gemara says, you're telling me that the word tameh yiyeh is used to include the guy who was obligated to become tameh. But the Gemara is going to say, but we need it for something else. You can't double dip. Yeah, no, but you can have a share, but then you can have something in addition to a share. But now the Gemara is going to say, I have something else. I have Ahuma Boyle the Ketanya for the following brighter. Tameh.
Wait, Rabbi, before we continue, I wanted to ask a question.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that only if someone in the same room as the dead person will be tameh. But what if I touch the tameh and then I touch you? You become also tameh, even if you're not in the same room, right?
Right. That you become an avatama, correct.
And for that reason, we all tameh today, basically, right?
I mean, there's a lot of people go to funerals, and there's a lot of things going. You know, every people become tameh as a result of that.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's like basically today there is not known for anyone to be pure because we don't have the para aduma, basically.
Right. So the Gemara says, look, Hu Tanya. We need the word tameh to include another case. Remember, we said the case of the Torah was that a person became tameh from a dead body. But we have another case. Even let's say a person, became tameh, it would seem not from a dead body. Let's say he was with his wife, or let's say he touched a dead animal that wasn't slaughtered. And in order to remove the tumah, he has to go to the mikveh. He goes to the mikveh, and then he waits for the sun to go down. He waits for the sun to go down, goes to the mikveh, waits for the sun to go down, then he becomes tahor. Then he becomes purified. That's the process. And what happened was, the guy went ahead, he went to the mikveh, but he didn't wait for the sun to go down. He didn't wait for the sun to go down yet. He became tameh, he went to the mikveh, but he needs to wait till sundown to become tahor. And before sundown, he goes into the Beit HaMikdash. So he's still tameh. So this, because that ends the process. It's also similar to, they go to the mikveh also, and the day is not over until it's night. So the Gemara says, tameh l'rabot et l'tuyom. I mean, the women go to the mikveh. The women specifically go to the mikveh at night. General circumstances, normal circumstances, the women go to mikveh at night. So the Gemara says, l'rabot tfuyom. It comes to include the case of a tfuyom. We'll continue on Monday. I want to wish everyone I don't want to make people late to davening. It says there's a time to learn, it's time to pray. Now it's time to pray.
Hazak Baruch. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom to everybody. Thank you all for being on. Thank you very much. Beautiful Shabbat to everybody. A beautiful class today. I play. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you very much. Thank you too. Have a great Shabbat, everybody. Take care, Jaime. Good to see you. Jaime, I met your son last night. I met your younger son.
Yeah, that's Morris.
Very nice. I told him when he comes back here, he should join his dad at the class.
Okay, I'll tell him.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay,
Thank you.
bye-bye.
Bye-bye.